Perfect. Cool. It looks like we are live. Thanks, everybody. Super excited to bring you this. There's a whole team working behind that is actually helping us pull this off, but we're super glad that you're joining us today. So my name's Garrett Haberstock. I'm a disaster program manager based in the lovely state of Wyoming. The photo behind me was from a trip this past summer where we social distanced and spent some time in the wilderness in the Wind River mountain range. And there's a whole host here. So Cynthia Fisher is going to talk to us here in a little bit and do a system demo for us. We also have Neil, who's kind of this mastermind behind pulling all this off for us. Liz Mays and Phil Hankin are going to help with Q&A. And then Alicia is overseeing it all so that we don't actually mess anything up. So super, super glad that you're here with us. Thank you. So we want to just dive into this with shelter resident transition as our RC Care office hours. So it's important to acknowledge, like I want to be upfront about this. We know that the cross connection did mention that this was going to be DROs 1, 2, 3 using recovery planning and shelter resident transition levels 4 to 7. Through some conversations this week, as we better understood where we're at, we intentionally decided to exclude that very intentional conversation around DROs, kind of 2s and 3s. We just know that there's a couple extra things we need to do to get better clarity before we push that out. And we want to make sure that we can bring you the best information possible. So know that as we work through this, our time today is going to be focused on shelter resident transition, how it manifests on level 4 to 7s. But we'll do our best to accentuate a couple of those things like, hey, on a 2 or a 3, please think about this, please think about this, or here's how it will be different when we're employing that level 7. So as we dive into this, I do want to call out that Cynthia Fisher is going to join us later, and she is actually serving on the Louisiana DROs, those ones that started in the fall. She's one of the key movers and shakers and has been amazing in helping implement RC Care and the SRT service within it. So with that, let's start on a couple philosophical things. What is shelter resident transition? Then we'll work through kind of what the events look like in the system. We'll talk a little bit about user access roles in the system. We'll talk about intake, and then we'll dive into that demo. So right, we see it on the screen, shelter resident transition. I want to start by saying it's not new, it's not totally different. We've always been helping individuals transition from our shelters. Now we just have an intentional program, a process, it's built into RC Care, there's funding available, and really what it is, it's a response process that's an aspect of client-first sheltering, providing those resources so that we can help overcome articulated and anticipated needs. Ultimately, for the goal on the outcome, right, that we're helping individuals, whether it's us, the Red Cross, or we're facilitating it with partners, transitioning folks to safe, sanitary, and sustainable housing solution. Just keep that as the foundation in your mind. We published a doctrine bulletin somewhere in the ballpark of 18 months ago. We've had the chance to implement it on a couple of operations. It went full-fledged this fall on all of the disasters, and then Oregon and Louisiana were really the first DROs to use the shelter resident transition service within RC Care, and we've learned a ton from it. And so what we want to do is we want to tell you about some of that stuff that we've learned. So when events are created within RC Care, there are these things called event modules, and based on the level of the event, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, different people have the ability to create the event. And when events are created, you add event modules. Sometimes they happen automatically. Sometimes you have to add them to the event itself so that the service can be provided. So what we're seeing here on the screen, right, we see immediate assistance, recovery planning, individual disaster care. All of those are services that we see on those 2s and 3s. And we see those even on larger operations. But when approved, we'll see the shelter resident transition event module added. What that allows us to do is add the service to the case so that we can provide our shelter resident transition assistance within RC Care. What is that assistance, right? This is pulling directly from the Financial Core Control Standards and Procedures document, where it really unpacks what shelter resident transition is. You'll notice first that qualifying events are level 4 or greater. That's 4, 5, 6, and 7. We see what our program eligibility is, right? They need to be in a Red Cross shelter. They're a client within it for at least 3 or more days, or there's some immediate need that a shelter manager acknowledges and approves, and we can take an action to overcome that need. they need to have one of those recovery roadblocks. Here it's important to note that the recovery roadblocks that we see within the shelter resident transition service are the same that we see within the recovery planning service. So housing, transportation, etc. Those are the same, and we're trying to build this so that they're similar user experiences. And then when we issue those funds, we want to make sure that they can successfully transition within 72 hours. Cynthia will talk us through what some of these fields look like and how we can maximize it. And then at the end, we'll just further reinforce how important accurate documentation in the system is, because that helps us build quality reports and some pretty cool visualization on dashboards. On the right-hand side, far right-hand side, we just want to call out some of those confirmations. So we know when we go through intake that there's some confirmations that need to happen on program eligibility, damage, etc. It's important to note that damage is not a driving factor for shelter resident transition, which means they don't have to have major destroyed to be eligible for it, which is different from our immediate assistance and uninhabitable. And then the address isn't a required confirmation either, but what it means is we have to have the event confirmed and the ID confirmed to be able to issue that assistance. So important to note, before we move on to our next slide, is that on those 2s and 3s, we'll use recovery planning, the service, and in those fundings that we see day in and day out. So same level of supplemental assistance, etc. will be eligible to help the client transition if we're on a level 2 operation and we have a shelter. We're going to use that recovery planning, supplemental assistance, etc. When we're on our larger operations, we're going to use shelter resident transition 4s to 7s, and it's a different funding stream. It's a different line item, think of it that way, and we can do some different things with it that we'll get into in the demo. So before we get to the demo, we've got to talk about system access. We've all learned through this. It's important to note that there's not yet an operational account authorizer job tool. It's in the works. It'll be great when it comes out, and we're really looking forward to it. But just know that just like CAS 2.0, when we deployed to an operation, we needed to be given access if we were going to a different division. Right now, that event sharing is at a regional level. So when I, Gehrig, deploy into Louisiana, I need to make sure through the OAA I'm getting the right event access so that I can see the Louisiana cases. Otherwise, I might not be able to see them. Also important to note that if you are say you're an intake worker during Blue Skies work and you deploy and you've become a caseworker on your operation, that role change will limit your ability to see cases from back home. So when Cynthia deploys and her role goes from intake worker to caseworker, she'll only be able to see the event that she's assigned as a caseworker. She won't be able to see her home region work. So just keep that in mind as you're thinking about your access levels day to day and then how that's going to impact deployments. But no, if your role is the same, so you go caseworker to caseworker, intake supervisor to intake supervisor, you'll be able to see both. It's only if there's a role shift. Unpacking some of these, we'll focus in specifically for shelter resident transition and just some role considerations within the system. And when I say role, that's really user access and what level of access you have within the system, just to delineate that from other roles we might have. So if we're an SRT caseworker, the role that the user access in RC care we should have would be the caseworker role. If we're serving in a supervisor level, right, then we would want that casework supervisor intake or document review based on what's needed. Also know that there is a RDO DRO exception role that allows for some approval of user access. I apologize, I keep using the wrong word. User access that would allow for that increased financial assistance that is eligible through shelter resident transition above the $300 mark. And then based on some other roles within the operation, we might need to have different user accesses, a strictly document reviewer, maybe there's a compliance reviewer that comes in, but these are all things we need to be thinking about as we request different user accesses for our operations. Showing what some of these role user accesses can do within the system, right? So as we all know, if we're an intake worker, we can do intake. We can't do follow-up casework. And so if somebody comes with that, we'll need to request a different role, user access for them in the system based on their role on the operation. So we see the caseworker, that second line, they can do more things, intake supervisor, etc. Important to note through here and we'll hear a little bit more about later, is if people have access to the same thing. So if I'm a caseworker and I'm doing shelter resident transition and we're working with individual disaster care, IDC, like how are we going to best work together within the system to maximize that? And just know the system still requires external coordination. Like I still need to call Cynthia and talk to her about what's going on. I shouldn't be fully dependent on the system itself. Last big one I want to talk about before we prime Cynthia to take over and do a system demo for us is intake. So for the most part, intake will be the exact same, whether we're responding to a single family house fire or whether we're responding to the next level 7 DRO. The intake look and feel will be very similar. There's a couple of nuances that we want to call out. So we'll start on the left-hand side of the screen and work our way over. So on a level 1, 2, or 3 operation, recovery planning is automatically added to the case. When we're on a level 4, 5, 6, or 7, the client can opt into recovery planning. What's important to note is that if they choose to opt into recovery planning, the service will be added, but we still need to use the shelter resident transition service for that funding mechanism and documentation. So no, if we're on a level 5 event and I get to this screen and I select yes, it's going to add the service for me, and it will also give me the option to add the shelter resident transition service, which Cynthia will show us how to do. And that's where that funding mechanism comes to on those larger level events. The other thing is we get this opportunity to say yes or no, they're in a partner or Red Cross managed shelter. If we're doing intake for somebody and we know they're in a shelter, we should probably choose yes, just so we're documenting well and we're getting good information at the beginning on our clients. The other thing we want to call out, and this is a bit of a preview, is around the damage assessment. So normally when those larger operations, we might be employing the RC Collect, we're getting DA teams out, we're getting great information into RC View. They're working to build a connection between RC View and RC Care that's called a DA aggregator. So our first picture shows us if we did intake and the system didn't have any damage, we would need to confirm it ourselves, right? That's just what we do on a response if we didn't get that. Secondly, the second option with the damage assessment confirmed with the check marks and the damage classification pulling in major, what that means is that the aggregator connection found the address and is wanting to pull in the damage automatically because it's already been confirmed and documented in the system. So just know in the future when you're on an operation, you could see either one of those, even if the aggregator is working and set up properly. Because they might not have damage assessment yet, right? So just know that those are two different experiences you might see in the system, but know that we're going to have some more information forthcoming about how we really maximize that once that's fully built out in the system. Just want to introduce this currently. So I'm going to set up Cynthia real quick, and then we'll pause for questions before she fully takes over. So we're going to jump into a system demo with Cynthia. She is currently deployed to Louisiana. She's been supporting it for, I don't know, like 3 months or something. She's now in person there working, and we're super glad that she's going to join us. And as she takes over for the screen control, we just want to know that in the event, like where we're going to pick up is that the event has already been created, that the users have the proper access that's been requested via the account authorizer, that the case was created through RC Care intake, and that the provision of shelter resident transition assistance and that financial assistance has been approved. So as she's talking, that's kind of where we're starting with as we go forward. So Cynthia, I see that you now have the screen. Before we totally start, Liz and Flo, we want to pause and see if there's any questions outstanding that we should answer before we continue on.
Thanks, Garrett. We have a couple here. And I think you answered it, but we'll put it out there again in case there was still need clarification. Is recovery planning service needed or is this an option?
Yep, so client on level 1, 2s, and 3s, recovery planning is automatically added. Clients can choose to opt into it on 4, 5, 6, and 7, but know if we opt into it and if we have it, it's going to add an extra service for us. You can document some of the recovery barriers, issue referrals through that service, but if you're going to provide funding or a more specific tailor to shelter resident transition, you'll want to use the shelter resident transition service because it asks a couple of different questions. The funding is different based on program eligibility.
Thanks, Garrick. And here's another one around funding.
Yep.
If an SRT client has verified damages and qualifies for immediate assistance, will the funding source be different from the SRT source?
It's a great question. So we should acknowledge that immediate assistance is different from shelter resident transition, right? Just like immediate assistance is different from supplemental assistance. So movement forward is that immediate assistance, that IA program will be provided through RC Care, and that's a different service, a different funding stream than shelter resident transition, which is its own system, its own qualifications, its own funding stream. So two independent things there.
Thank you, Garrick. And that ends it for questions so far.
Great. Cynthia, the floor is yours. Thank you. And Cynthia, you're muted, just so you know.
Yes, I was trying to find my mute button, and you can all see the screen okay?
We can.
Great, thank you. So I am thanking you in advance, Garrick, here for the time to share. I've learned a lot, and thank you for your education and the opportunity to share that back with American Red Cross across the board. So welcome. I'm going to jump right into showing you guys. This would be a case was set up, a client was set up in intake and attached to a case. And when that comes in, there are services that we can add. Across here are our services for referrals. These are area specific. We are going to add an SRT service today. And we will simply click on Add SRT Service, and it will ask for the shelter. This would be the current shelter name. We are currently sitting at the Sheraton, so I will use that. And for our entry date, we have many that came in August 28th or a little later. Bed cot space, we are entering that as the room number. And we would indicate that they are sleeping inside of the shelter to align with our shelter resident transition plan. If they are outside of the shelter, they're not eligible for services through the shelter resident transition at this time. We do indicate whether or not they have any pets, and we'll go ahead and say yes so that you can see the screen process. And they ask for the pet's name. I will put my pet's name, Coda. A little dog, and then they ask what kind of dog, so you have to tell. I guess you have to spell well too. So Aussie Shepherd, and then next they'll ask again, are there any other pets? So if you have an iguana, a cat, anything else, those would be in here. Service animals would also be indicated on here for sheltering purposes to make sure that we know that we can help take care of those animals. Finish up the adding of the transition, and as you can see, it looks blank. It says they already have one. We have to click back onto services, and then we go to what I call the little half circle arrow in the middle right of the screen. Refresh your screen, and then you will have the shelter resident transition service added to, in this case, had other services already added. So going into the shelter resident transition service, you will see across the top we have recovery roadblocks, create referrals, financial assistance, details, and exception notes. We are going to go ahead and jump into creating the first thing we do is create a recovery roadblock. And this little page is nice because in the field, it does give you a reminder of how to communicate with the client. And so in the field, when everybody's coming at you and you're trying to do your best to fill out, the caseworkers, disaster caseworkers, can actually just use this little tool to ask for more information along the way. So thank you for that. So we're adding a new recovery roadblock, being the first item to move forward. And for this, Cynthia Fisher, we are going to go ahead and say that we do have a planned exit shelter date. There's the option of yes or no. We're going to, for this purpose, say yes. We don't put an actual shelter date exit at this time because it is not an actual shelter date exit, but we will put today as the date that the SRT caseworker actually had the last contact with the client, because we're building the roadblock. This will give us an opportunity to discuss when the client wants to leave, and we'll just say she's planning on leaving the 27th or on the 7th of February. And then we also can align when we plan to have our next contact with the client. So we can ask the client to come back. You can make an appointment in Teams very easily to block yourself out, to give yourself time with the client as well. And this is a great opportunity. Are your needs being met in the shelter? We can inquire if there's something missing in their services that they're being provided in the shelter right now and document that. And if it's a no, that gives us an opportunity to sit down and address those and identify those needs that might be needed as part of the recovery package. You also have a place for notes here, which is really nice. You can put in things about ETAs for moving. You can put in notes about part of their recovery plan that might not fit anyplace else. This is a great time to also ask, and we find it more yeses than nos in this conversation. Opportunity to talk to them about, do they need health services, dental services, vision services, assistance in anything. Most of them, it's the first time they're really being asked that when we're setting up this roadblock with a client, and they generally say yes. So I think it's come as a little surprise in the field. The same with spiritual care and mental health. So I'm going to go ahead and mark these all as yes. And then the next section gives us the opportunity to talk about housing situation. This is for your prior to disaster. And we will say that this was a renter. Cynthia was renting a place or a room from someone. And it is good to qualify that for whether or not they have a written agreement with the party for part of the recovery processes. We do like to look at the leases that they had and written documentation. The condition of your home. Do you know the condition of your home? Unfortunately, on the level 7, many of them are coming in destroyed, in Oregon and Louisiana. My heart goes out to y'all. Do you plan to return home at this time that home is destroyed? So many of the answers are no. And then does it need to be cleaned or repaired? Not applicable. All roadblocks, recovery roadblocks, have to have a primary SRT recovery barrier. And this is the one location that needs to go in. If this is not completed, the recovery roadblock won't save for you. So for us, the number one recovery roadblock is housing here. So we're going to go ahead and put that one in. And does a client need short-term lodging before returning home? You can say yes or no. They are in the shelter and plan to go home. And it's no. So the answer here is yes, they will need short-term housing before returning home. Debris removal. They could have the belongings in the house that was flooded and that they have to get their belongings out. This could qualify as an answer to that debris removal question. This just gives us a nice time to have a conversation with the client and really start digging into what the recovery plan might look like as we discuss these questions. So it's really important to go through the process, and we find it takes about half hour to 45 minutes per client once we really start walking through it with them and having the side conversations. And gives us an opportunity to start building the plan for recovery as well. So do you need assistance getting housing is the next question. Most people who are still in shelter do need assistance getting housing. Ask, do you have the willingness to relocate? And we'll say yes. And do you need pet-friendly housing? We'll say yes. Do you have barriers to moving? We're going to say yes. We're going to say that Cynthia lost it all and she needs help recovering furniture, storage of items. Oops, again, apologize for the bad spelling for you all. And then the other section that we'll go down to is, do you have insurance? And we'll just say yes, that Cynthia had renter's insurance, and we just select it and choose that. And then I have another type of insurance, and that we can just leave blank. It does not have to be filled in. And then the next question is, has client registered for FEMA? And we're going to say yes, pending eligibility, and act as if we just don't know today, because most clients seem to not know. So that's a very common answer. Has the client completed a FEMA inspection? For this stage of the game, most of them are completed, but there will be those families that say they don't know. It was the landlord's house. I don't know if it was inspected, so there is an unknown option here. Or yes, they've been connecting with us and we're trying to meet for pending. And then we ask for the client's FEMA registration number, and we can just put that FEMA number into the slot, and that would be good. Has a client been approved for TSA? Now, TSA on this DRO has not been initiated at this time, so we are not able to answer this. So we have been leaving it blank because it hasn't been activated for this DRO and DR in Louisiana. We could ask if the client was on a HUD housing program before. It does give us an opportunity to talk to them about veterans status, rehousing, emergency project housing. We'll just say that this was a Section 8 housing. And if no, I'm missing this one. Garrick, I might have to have you jump in on that later if there's a question on that other. Normally we don't put anything in here, so I haven't hit that answer yet. Do you have reliable transportation? I'm going to say no. We'll just say that the client lost this in the disaster. And do you have a source of income? We will say unemployed, unemployment. And when do you need financial aid to move? We will say when client identifies rental opportunity to move to. So it just lets whoever's reading this or generating a report know when. We could also put this as a date. So we'll say our target date for this client is actually 2/7/21. This we'll say confirms, sorry, confirms rental opportunity to move into. So they've identified one, they want to move out on the 7th, and when they confirm the move, we'll give them the money. And we always ask them, can any family or friends assist you right now? And most of the answers at this point are still no. Did you have a caseworker working with you before? We can say yes. There was other caseworkers with the Red Cross that came to the table. And here's where we put a short little blurb about what their transition plan is from the shelter. And we would just say client plans to move into shared home at 123 Main Street. We'll put New Orleans because I'm all over the table. And this is a great little measurement and good point to ask clients, are you missing any paperwork? And then there's a drop-down section here where you can identify maybe what they lost in the fire or storm and help them identify. What we have been finding, this need for Social Security cards, birth certificates that have been lost are usually the first things that are required to get assistance. Driver's license to prove who they are, and if they've lost all of this, these are really the first hurdles that they have to move on. So now that we're all done with this recovery roadblock, we just hit save. And it will create its summary sheet for you here, and you can just scroll through. Let's say I want to change this barrier. I can go in and add or remove anything I want, save it, and it will come back. So this is a great summary page, great editing page. You can go straight to the item that you want to work with. So these tabs, this is Cynthia Fisher's case. Her tab is up here. Within the case, there's the client contact tab. There's the case tab. There is the service tab I have open called Shelter Resident Transition, and there is the Recovery Roadblock tab. The one that I am in currently is the highlighted red one. So the RR0667 is the Recovery Roadblock. I'm just going to close that right now. And just pause if there's any questions that anybody might have.
Thanks, Cynthia. Yes, we do have some questions. On large DROs, the clients were coming into our headquarters to get assistance. Caseworkers did the intake and the recovery services. Are we going to be able to do this in RC Care?
So the recovery services in CAN or the recovery services elsewhere? Which recovery services are you identifying for RC Cares, CAN, or somewhere else?
I'm afraid the question is not that specific. If you could type in that piece, we'll see if we can circle back to that question.
Yeah, Liz, this is Garrick. I can take a stab at that.
Okay.
Yeah, so remember that just because the system changed, we still want to be providing services to clients. And so if headquarters is seeing people come into the headquarters seeking assistance, the first thing we need to do is make sure it's being directed to the right people in the recovery realm to provide that support. But RC Care doesn't preclude us from providing assistance at headquarters or in a shelter or at a mark, right? That doesn't change. Just make sure the right people are engaged so that, yes, it's okay to provide that type of assistance. And then there's a process within the headquarters about how that will be handled whenever it surfaces again.
Thank you. The next question, will shelters in the DRO be a drop-down list or do we type it in every time? Cynthia, looks like she has the answer.
So that's a really good one. And we feel the pain with that. For this, we are handwriting it in. Sorry, let me go back to the shelter page here. So when we create the service and we say which shelter they're in, it is one that does not have a drop down, and it is one that for this DRO in Louisiana, we have taken to just the first name of the shelter. And so Best Western and Sheraton for us at this time is where our two choices. So it's easy. And I would have to defer to Garrick about any future plans to create a more user-friendly drop-down consistent list.
Yeah, we hear the pleas. I'll put it that way. At the current time, I think Cynthia said it so well that the DRO defined the standard naming conventions for their shelter, right? Cynthia, I think you guys saw 1,700 different ways that Sheridan was spelled or implemented in the system. And so the DRO currently will define that standard naming convention for shelters.
And just a side note on that, it's really important that that gets established early on, because reports will be generated off of this information. So if it's put in 1,700 different ways, you will have 1,700 different ways to look at the reports, and that will get sore on the eyes.
Thank you. How long will it take for DA information in RC Collect to appear in RC Care?
So the DA information can be seen on the tab with the client number. And when you do an intake, it is almost immediate that that damage classification comes in. If it's not there, there is an acceleration method to push that up to the DDA team for the DRR.
Thank you, Cynthia. Here's another one for you, Cynthia. So if a client has 2 dogs of the same breed, you will have to enter each separately?
That is correct. And unfortunately, I'm past that page with the information here in the intake and creation of a shelter recovery service. But there is always this little side window where it says pets 1, and then I can view all. I can view more about the pet, and I can, believe, even add one if one came into the shelter. So I can add Daisy, and you can see bird, fish, guinea pig, hamster, mouse. We'll just say that's a cat, we're adding it, and we'll call it a mix. And that's how easy it would be to manage the animals in the shelter. And with this type of information, it's really nice because we can actually create reports that Garrick will talk about that will help us connect maybe the humane services with the people who have animals in the shelters.
Thank you, Cynthia. Will we still be working with NCS SRT tracking tool as well, or is that no longer necessary?
Great question, and I'm sure Garrick will touch base on this again, but the NCS tracking tool and the sheltering is right now a separate product. Sheltering has a separate product than recovery services. Sheltering, transitional services, IDC services are all working out of RC Care right now. And, great question. I've had that question already too. Would love to see them merge in the future, but for today, NCS tool and then the RCC tool for us, this team.
Okay, thank you. And I had this question as well. What is TSA?
Okay, TSA is temporary shelter assistance. It's transitional funding that I believe comes from off of FEMA. I'm sorry, I'm not as versed in it because we haven't seen it yet. But it is just, as I understand, a FEMA line of funds that will be made eligible to certain parties that have registered with FEMA. Funds. It should be funds at the end of the day, as I understand.
Thank you. Can you save roadblocks before you finish the page? I think when you walk through some, okay.
Yes, absolutely. Let me just pop over there. As I was entering it, at any point, if I needed to walk away, the only thing that, Karen, don't shoot me. The only thing that is absolutely required in order for you to save is that you have to mark the primary SRT recovery barrier Outside of that, the rest of it is just building. And the importance of building this information, though, is going to fall into the reporting and the ease of use for management to just wrap their hands around where everybody is at and how things are going and how it's moving. So simple answer is yes, you can save at any point as long as you have this one item marked, but functionality and doing a service to the whole Red Cross and to your clients is better served to take the time to finish the red block.
Thank you. Next question is it now possible for SRT to deliver a report on a specific demographic? For example, a partner is offering backpacks for kids in shelters. Is it possible to get a sum of kids ages K through 12 and a breakdown per age range?
Thank you. That's a great question. And I will defer that one to Garrig later as he touches on reports, if that's okay.
Thank you. Can a recovery caseworker on the scene do both the intake and the recovery services?
Yes. Yes, very simply, many can. Some of that's going to depend upon your privilege. So there is, for this DRO, there are casework supervisors with intake roles, and there are casework supervisors that have LTRO roles, and an LTRO is one that cannot do intake at all. You block that person out from doing intake because of their review role.
Thank you. And how would you document that the client needed accessible housing?
ADA accessible housing could be marked in several locations. You can put it as part of the transition plan. But let's click on the recovery roadblock. That's a great question and a great point, because we do have housing being the barrier. And there is let me find the spot for you. Here is the spot. Thank you. Not returning to pre-disaster housing. This question was, do you have barriers to moving? And if yes, what are the barriers? This would be a great spot to add ADA needed or something along the lines. But that is a great item that would be nice to have that qualified further. Garrig, that note's for you.
Noted.
We have two more questions. Is there the same or more information in SRT services compared to recovery planning? The question is, why collect data in two services when you must use SRT since the client resides in a shelter?
So that is a great question. We currently are not using the, and I'll just show you what you're talking. Well, actually, I can't add it on this one. Garrig, should I take a look at this one real quick? Because I believe, nope, you don't have it there either. Okay, recovery planning was added here at intake. And currently, the only time that you can easily add this that I'm aware of is right at intake. It will ask them in the intake if they need recovery planning assistance. And when you mark yes on intake, it does come up and put the recovery planning in here. We have not had an overlap with that, so I will defer to Garrig for further discussion on that if he'd like.
Yeah, I'll answer from a broader perspective. I think it was a great start, Cynthia, to set us up well for this. So, very astute observation, right? It doesn't make sense to collect a bunch of information if we're just going to duplicate it back and forth. So know that when you go through intake, you have the option on level 4s to 7s to select the recovery planning service to add it. And that might be applicable in some instances on a level 4 to 7 when somebody's not in a shelter, right? That can still be very valuable information to document that recovery planning service. That's part of the reason it's there. If we know that we're going to be using the shelter resident transition service because we're working with a shelter client, we might choose to leave that as no, but no, if the client does say yes, we can toggle it and we can collect some information. But as noted, there's similarities in the field. So we just want to be mindful that we're maximizing the service and we're not duplicating efforts or anything like that. But kind of the reason why it's there, and then just acknowledge we use shelter resident transition when we're supporting folks transition from the shelter, and we might not use recovery planning in that instance. And through intake, you have the option to add it or to not add it.
Thank you, Garrick. And the last question for this segment, is there a place to put down where the animal is a service animal? Would that be in the case comments?
Another great question. It does not indicate whether or not the animal is a service animal or not in here specifically, but another great note for Garrig to take on. But if we wanted to, you could simply add the language here. And it wouldn't show in this section of it, but it would if the client, if it was clicked on, you could see that it's a service animal by the note.
Thank you, Cynthia. That's it for the questions so far.
All right, great. Thank you guys for understanding what I'm saying. Just another note for the shelter resident transition processing. Only one roadblock is required to do the shelter resident transition service for the client. There may be some need that you or the caseworker might see to want to add another roadblock. That function is available to you. It's not necessary. And we are currently exploring how important it is in reporting. So more on that as this unfolds. But let's say I had a child and needed childcare so that I could go to work. That would be a roadblock that could be encouraged to be added. If I had mental health needs, we can flag that as a roadblock as well. Job-related, transportation. So these roadblocks are set. And in Garrick's presentation of reporting, each one of these could be monitored by management to see where the greatest needs are. And there's benefit to multiple roadblocks as we see it, but at this time, it's not a necessity to move forward with the shelter recovery transition. I'm sorry, the shelter resident transition services. So we're just going to go through that there is one roadblock, and we can create referrals. We're not working in that department at this time through RC Cares. We are looking at the details real quick. These are our details, and one of the tricks to get through this is to see this summary sheet and make sure that the information is correct, updated as needed. And you can see here, recovery roadblock, you saw us go through the process, but you can see it didn't attach here. And so one of the processes for reporting purposes, the report is going to pull from this field. We want to make sure that the recovery roadblock has been activated to this. So we want to put the roadblock. Now each case where we create a roadblock for each client has a unique roadblock number. You don't want to use somebody else's roadblock number, so you can actually grab it right here. If you can't remember what the number was, copy it and paste it in here as well. I can save it along the way, just like building the roadblock. We are using the shelter manager name information. You just click on the little pencil to the right and it allows you to begin editing the field. So on this I won't. I don't want to put people's numbers in and have them get strange emails, but we would put a Red Cross email in here for our shelter manager. And yes, if I could spell. And then your name. And then we would put the shelter plan, presenting ourselves that we are ready to get to a place where we're asking for a recovery transition plan to be built and financial assistance to be asked. So we're going to propose that the client is moving to 123 Main in New Orleans, Sunday, 2/7. And this is just giving the DRO team the idea that we are in a final countdown and this is the plan. It gives them a quick shot to look at it. They can see that there's an address they're going to and that the information is being processed. The other fields here are SRT approval status and approval submitter. These are going to come in when we make the financial request. And then up here on the right is the approval submitter and whether or not the DRO exception is approved or rejected and the note as to why. And the service owner, we can put that in as the caseworker's name. So in this case, it would be the RCC supervisor intake who's logged in. We put them in as a service owner, and since this isn't a test field, I'm not sure which one that would be. So we'll just save, and oh, it wants a real email. I am just going to leave that blank for now. My apologies. Let's see if it will save. It has a nice little feature where it comes up with the circle with the line through it saying you don't get to go any further, and that's a great place. It takes you right back to the field that you need to resubmit. So I think I am all ready. I've talked to Cynthia and she is ready to get out of the shelter. Again, I'm going to refresh the page just so everything is ready to go. And I'm going to click on shelter resident transition one last time and go directly to financial assistance. And in this case, I am going to get a window and it asks me, do I want financial assistance for the client? If you say no and hit next, it will close the case. So if you're done and they don't need financial assistance, you say no and it closes the case and everybody moves on to the next client. If you say yes, you're able to click next and it will ask you how much you want. And in this case, we'll just say that Cynthia needs $700. And we'll suppose that I have already built a nice narrative and drop that into the feed through a case comment. I'll just say narrative submitted, but you get the idea of the paragraph that the DRO exception is going to want for that. If you don't, I have a great manager here that will be happy to teach you about narratives. So we're going to ask for $700 for this. This will trigger me of a financial assistance exceeding $300. And it will say, please click next to begin the DRO exception approval process. It's really simple. We just click next and it has been submitted to the DRO up team from the caseworker to do the reviews. Just hit finish and you'll see that it is over here. And this is what your review team, so this would be the manager would see this window that says the exception amount of 700. They will review the case narratives and see what is here, what's been submitted by the caseworker. They will also go to the details page to see that the information in the details page is completed and that there is a planned exit date, which we will easily find in the recovery roadblock. And so this client, it has a plan. We have a date. Looks like the caseworker has been efficient. but maybe we know that the client has a rejected FEMA at this point. So within the narrative, we may want to go back in and say not eligible. So we can do that. And then back here on the summary page, by clicking on the Shelter Resident Transition tab, we see this. Now, as a caseworker, we wouldn't see this. This is going to be, again, the manager. The manager would click next, and that would go up to whoever's in line to approve the DRO exceptions on that DR. And with that, I will pause for questions because I believe that is what I have to offer you today.
Thank you, Cynthia. We have a few more questions for you and Garrig. If a client has lost their home and is staying with relatives in the next county, do they receive assistance since they aren't in the shelter? I'm assuming SRT assistance.
So happy to answer that for you. Based upon my knowledge, shelter resident transition services are only being offered to people who are in shelter. So if they are in a family friend's house and not in shelter, or have already returned to their home and are trying to live it out and repair in their home, they would be contacting Red Cross under a different service tab. And Garrig, I will defer to you for the rest of that.
I will only add that in that instance, that's where that immediate assistance that's based on the damage classification of their home would come into play. But Cynthia, I think you answered it perfectly.
Okay.
Thank you. Great question. Will data collected during the SRT auto-populate with recovery planning fields for recovery to verify if the information is still current?
Great question. I am not on the recovery planning side of things. I am still in the shelter resident transition. So I will defer to Garrig.
Yeah, it's a great question. So right, we talked a little bit about the connection between shelter resident transition service, recovery planning the service. At present, the fields don't auto-populate one another. But what's important to acknowledge is that via the specialty tracks and kind of the user system roles and user roles on operations and within shelter resident transition, most of our recovery workers who would have deployed in recovery, like thinking recovery minded previously, now deploy in a shelter resident transition role. And so recovery workers working with clients in a shelter will be using shelter resident transition service to document their work. So it's kind of the same person using two different systems based off of what service the client needs. And then just know that there are some specialty tracks now available for shelter resident transition.
Thank you. If the client has found someone to take care of their pet while they are in the shelter, would we still input it in RC Care? Also, would this be noted in the case notes or in another part of the system?
Awesome. Love these pet questions. So do you have any pets? Is yes to the question that you do. This is important in recovery housing and making the plan if they're recovering with their pets. There's also a question of, let's see, of how many pets. I know that there is, I think that it, nope, sorry. I'm bugging around for it and I'm not seeing it in the sandbox. So there is the, do you have any pets? And this is just slightly different. We actually have how many pets do you have currently showing on our dashboard. So that would be summarized in the detail page. It's not showing in the sandbox. Again, I think when we come to pets, if they're recovering with other people, I think that's important to know. If they're in the shelter, the shelter wants to know how many pets are here in the shelter, how many animals are in the shelter that we're keeping tabs of, but certainly under breed, we could certainly expand that and ask Eric to make a separate field for us if they are in shelter or off-site. So that's for you, Garrick. It's certainly a pony.
Thanks, Cynthia. I'll add to that because I think this is a really good question, because there's a conceptual piece that we can spend a second on to a prior question about non-congregate shelter client tracking tools. So remember that RC Care is going to be primarily used by those recovery workers supporting transitions and documenting. And if you're a caseworker working with a client, you want to know if they have a pet that they're going to recover with, because that might impact the type of housing that they're available for.
Yeah.
Separate from that recovery sphere is the non-congregate client tracking tool that our mass care sheltering partners are going to use, because they want to, they probably wouldn't list a pet because the pet's not in the shelter. But as we think about transitioning forward, that's a key indicator and something we need to be aware of as we build that transition plan holistically for the client.
Thank you. If a client gets moved to another shelter, do we change the name of the shelter at that time under the SRT, or do we just make a case comment if they're in a new shelter than when they were first registered?
That's a great question. I have expressed that same question, and how we have chosen to do it on this DR is we just put the current shelter name. If you put more than the one shelter name in here, it will throw off your reports that you want to see. And the perfect place for the narrative that we brought in from the NCS tool is we dropped the case narratives from sheltering into the text of a case comments and logged it here. So we are always able to see what sheltering had at the time we did this intake. We're currently in a place where we will not be condensing any further down on our shelters. So we're not going to have that problem of making that move. But if you did move them out of the shelter and move them to a different shelter with a different room number, you can just simply update these two tools and update their room number here. And if you wanted to document it in your field, you could just put Sheraton 1, 2, 3, 4, room moved to Best Western, room 2, 3, 4, 5, and log that case note, that case comment, and it would be there. And you could say that it was for consolidation, or let's say you wanted to come back and say somebody was wondering why they got moved. We could say consolidated. So you can just log that and quickly jump back to your shelter resident plan, make the updates on the rooms, and then everything would be honky-dory for that. Best Western. There you go. And you're all done. You've moved them.
Thanks, Cynthia. Garrick, I wanted to do a time check. We've got 4 more questions, but I know you had some additional content. Do you want to continue with questions or circle back?
Yeah, thanks, Liz. Let's take 2 more,
Okay.
and then we'll try to tackle the ones at the end, the other ones.
Okay. The next question is, if a client has community, DHHS service, etc., suggest type and name of service in a specific box, include caseworker name and phone number if available to help with transition out and working with community partners. This sounds like a general comment. So I'm going to move on to the next question. And if you want to react to that, let me know, Garrett or Cynthia. Does a casework supervisor role approve and forward the DRO exception, then apply funds after the DRO funds are approved?
So thank you. Good question. Our DR caseworkers are entering the recovery and requesting the financial assistance. The manager is approving the exception to go into a DRO. I'm sorry, they're approving the request, but anything that goes to DRO exception will follow the rules of DRO exceptions at that DR, which is usually your director, as I understand.
Thank you. And the final question before we move on is, if an SRT client has verified damages and qualifies, I think they mean qualifies for SRT, what is the payment method?
Okay, great question. I'm going to go ahead and push this through as if it was all approved, I guess, and see where we can go from that. So this would go into the next window, and it's been submitted for, so I'm acting as manager now, not the person who created the case, but the manager submitted that, and it goes in for approval. When that gets, let me just refresh the screen real quick. And when that gets pushed through, it's now down here that it's been pushed for approval by this submitter. And then when the job director approves it, it will go up here and be approved. As soon as that has an approval, the money will be showing available as commitments, ARC service commitments. It would show here. And then you can have either one person or have your DR design who is going to resolve payments, load CAT cards, EFTs, things like that, and you'd be all set. So that would be resolved payments for the final loadout.
Thank you. And I'll turn it back to you, Garrig.
Great, thanks so much, Liz. I'm gonna attempt to share my screen again. And as I do that, I just wanna take a second and say thank you so much, Cynthia. You're deployed in person down there. You just spent an hour with us telling us about your experiences. We're like, from the bottom of my heart, truly thank you for going in person, but even more for being willing to share with everybody the experiences that you've had within the system. We greatly, greatly appreciate it.
You're welcome. Thank you for the time, and sorry for running a little.
Don't worry about it. Liz, can you confirm for me that my screen is now displaying for everybody?
Yes, are we on follow-up, please?
It should be, yep.
Yep, you're good to go.
Great, thank you so much. Great, so before we dive into this, I want to just talk to two more things real quick, because I think it's meaningful, and I think the question's going to come up a couple more times as we move forward. So one is that NCS client tracking tool. So just to say it out loud, just know that RC Care is not intended to be the new electronic shelter registration, right? We still have our sheltering registration process and those tools that are available that we should be using early on in a disaster. And then we'll move over to opening up cases within RC Care. And I intentionally don't give a specific about when we're going to do that, because it might look a little bit different on every operation. The other piece is with the shelter resident transition recovery planning services, and how come there's two. Just know we've started some conversations about what does the alignment of those two look like, so that on the user experience, it's better and it's similar and it's friendly. So just know that we've started some of those conversations as well. All right, that said, let's spend a little bit of time talking about reports and dashboards. So you should now see my screen, and I'm logged into the production system of RC Care. And we hit this little home screen here. You can use the drop-down menu and you can go to reports and dashboards. When you pick on dashboards, we actually have one set up in the system. The easiest way to find it is under folders. You want to go to all folders here on the left-hand side of the screen. And then you're going to want to look for the shelter resident transition folder within RC Care. And I think I passed it up. It's right here, shelter resident transition. When you select this, you'll see a couple within there, and there's this LA Unified Command, Louisiana Unified Command Dashboard Draft 2.0. What that is we are pulling information from the work the team in Louisiana is doing, and we've created a couple of visualization tools to help them problem solve, think analytically about what's going on, and make informed decisions, right? We often hear about making data-driven decisions, and this is one of the really cool ways that RC Care allows us to do that. So I could spend an hour talking about dashboards, but I just want to call out a couple of really specific things and then show you the report and kind of how that can help us make a decision on actions that need to take. So for example, this first one I want to show is the second box here called the LAUC shelter resident exit dates. What this is doing is based off of that shelter exit date within the service, we can make a report that shows us linearly, so how many people are checking out each day. You'll notice that this first column, actually I'm going to zoom in a little bit just to make this even easier to see. Okay, the page is going to refresh a little bit, but I just want to make this easier because I'm on a really big screen, so I want to make sure you guys can see it as well and make this a bit bigger. So we have this lovely little LAUC shelter exit dates. You'll notice that one of them has a little line, there's no date on it. Those are all cases that do not have shelter exit date. Then we can see across the bottom where there has been actual exit dates, and there's an actual shelter exit date and a planned exit date. And so what we're doing with the Louisiana team is we have subscribed to a report that shows us every single day who is planning to transition from the shelter today and tomorrow and the next day, so that each morning the shelter resident transition team on the ground can coordinate with sheltering and say, hey, currently we plan for these 5 families to transition from the shelter today. Let's make sure we, shelter resident transition, supporting that transition, are aligned with sheltering so they can help facilitate that transition from the shelter successfully. So it's just one of the ways that we're using the system. Another one, I'm going to slide over, click on the screen. So another one will be here on this LAUC service household size. So what this is pulling is based on the makeup of a household, we can see how many individuals are in each household. So here we see that in the Sheridan Hotel, the purple, we have a household of 11. We also have a 1 of 8, 1 of 9, 1 of 8, 1 of 7, and a whole bunch of 1, right? So we can, when we collect accurate information, we can report it here, and that might inform some of our decision making. Those are really big families. Maybe that's someone we should start working with sooner in their transition from the shelter to support them move forward. What that also means, back to the question previously about the kids and the school bags, is if we can, age is entered into the system, there is a reportable field for age, and we could create a very similar visual using a filter on a report that we could say how many kids under the age of 17 are in which shelter, and we could create this visual just with that other information so that we could tell our partner that there are 15 kids ages 10 to 17 in the Sheridan, just as an example. So that's something new that we can now do within our recovery systems in helping make some of that decision-making processes. All right, I'm going to scroll down. I'm going to zoom out just a little bit because I'm not actually able to slide my screen to the left, and I'm going to want to show you one that's on the left. There we go. Now we're on the right size. So scroll down just a little bit further, and I'm going to call out this awaiting DRO RCCO approval. So Cynthia, when she did the payment process, she showed us a case that needed $700 to transition from the shelter. So then what happens is once approved at the, once screened at the supervisor level, it requires the DRO director for approval. But what happens is it goes into this like waiting for approval status. So that means we can build a report and we can generate on a daily basis, which we're currently doing at 2 o'clock every single day. which cases need the approval to receive their funds, right? And because we know people are busy, we know there's a lot of things going on, we can actually just hand over, here are the 3 case numbers that need approval. So currently in Louisiana, this light blue right here, we see that there are 2 cases that have been submitted for approval, which means they're waiting the DRO director to approve them within the system. So the funds are committed and then we can disperse them. We see that there are 2 within the Sheridan Hotel currently. So again, that's something that the system, when we input good data, we can build a fancy report, we can make a cool visual even. It really helps drive consistency and clarity in the services that we're providing. I'll call out just one more, thinking about how shelter resident transition and that service to our clients and shelters can connect in with other services like individual disaster care. So here on the center of the screen, we see this LAUC cases with IDC statuses. Each status, so whether it's needing health services, mental health, spiritual care, has a unique color to it. And so we can see that there are somewhere in the ballpark of 39 or so cases that have some type of IDC need. And all we're doing is just, that means that that is the service status of the service on the case. And then we can see, so for example, I can hover over here, I see that there are 7 cases in need of health services follow-up. You'll notice that this doesn't tell me the hotel, it doesn't tell me which clients. And so when we need to drill down a little bit deeper, we can actually click on the view report right here. And what it's going to do is it'll open up a brand new tab for us within the system. And we can now see line by line information of client information, case numbers, etc. Currently, there's an error on this one, so I'm going to do that just with a different report, just for an example. So I'm going to go back to the dashboard, scroll down a little bit, and we'll go into this RCCO approval one. So which cases need approval? So we can click this view report feature down here, and what it's going to do is it takes us into a report that gives us another image, and then if we scroll down, we can see approval statuses. So I'll scroll down and try not to make you too dizzy to our approvals, which is most of the way down. There is a way that you can set a filter so that it takes out some of this other information that might not be needed. But we can see it right here, the submitted for approval, there's actually 11. And then we see the cases, we can click on those and it goes straight into the case and we can review the detailed information about each of those cases and what type of funds that they're requesting at the present time. So this is just a cool enhancement to how we can visualize and think analytically about some of our data that we've always been capturing. We just now have a system that allows us to capture clean data, build cool reports that helps us visualize some of this information. Also important to note, in case any of you like to geek out on planning like I do, this is all exportable into a spreadsheet. So, right, RC Care is pretty amazing. It's not picture perfect. So we can pull some of this information into a spreadsheet, and then we could do some Power BI data reporting, etc., that would even allow us to manipulate that data further if we have those skills. So we've talked about dashboards. I just do want to introduce a little bit about reports for you. So here in the top left-hand corner, we'll click our little drop-down arrow and we'll select reports. And it's just important to note that there are tons and tons of templates out there. So if any of those that you saw are like, ooh, I really like that, I want to see that. If you go to all folders, and then there is a shelter resident transition folder that is also available. So you got to scroll down to the S's. And then when you open it up, you'll get to see some of those reports that have been built by myself, by Cynthia, by other people on operations. And then there's a little description about what they are. So you should be able to find these reports. If you open them up, you might not be able to see some of the data within them. And that simply has to do with that event sharing we talked about at the very, very beginning, where when you're assigned to an operation, you'll need to be given access to the specific event. If you're not in the region where the event has already occurred. So it's kind of a full circle we want to make there, that getting the proper access when you're assigned to an event is quintessential so that you can navigate well in the system. If you look through these reports and you're like, yeah, that's just not what we're looking for, you can do a new report here and you can actually create your own report. Or if you got ideas on what you think would be really good reports to be built, feel free to email srt@redcross.org and we'll be sure to post that so you have that email address. But srt@redcross.org, and we can start to conceptualize what is good information to be reporting that's really helpful for you all in the field making those decisions that are going to help clients transition forward in their recovery. So Liz, I'm going to pause there and we can take any remaining questions that are out there.
Thanks, Garrett. We have a few more. And this one looks like for Cynthia. Will you need to see a copy of a lease if a client is moving into shared housing?
So each manager, I'm sure, will want to trump me in saying this. So I'll defer to your DRO manager when answering this. But for us, yes, we need to not only see the lease, the agreement, the written month-to-month agreement, but we also are touching base with the person via phone.
Thank you. Will the recovery team be notified of those shelter clients that are ready for recovery planning services? If not, how has this been done to date?
So we are doing shelter resident transition services. This is those that our job is to help them transition out of the shelter. So everybody in shelter is a potential client for us to sit down and talk with. And the sooner we get our hands on them, the sooner we can actually provide services like IDC and start talking about a plan. Definitely the most critical are the last ones out. So at this point at Louisiana, I would just say start early.
Yeah, Cynthia, I'll add to that. And hopefully this comes up quickly. It's a big data set, so it takes a little bit. But to answer that question specifically, so this isn't the exact report. This is a mere one where we're doing, you're seeing me. Let me share the right screen here. Perfect, there we go. So you should now be seeing a Salesforce report. So I've subscribed to a report within RC Care, and each day at a specified time, it sends me information. And you can set the same thing up for your shelter clients where you're receiving the report every day at 8 a.m. in the morning, 7 a.m. in the morning. And then you can look at that and say, okay, here are the ones that are leaving. But just know that the system isn't automatically going to send this information to the shelter manager. We'll probably need to provide that to them and say, here are the 5 households. Here are the 10 households that plan to transition today.
Thank you. Are referrals given for housing agencies, et cetera, Aunt Bertha, and are Aunt Bertha referrals listed in SRT?
So the current use of SRT, we are not using referrals. We are purely functioning in a plan and helping them meet that plan and filling gaps. We are still using CAN for referrals at this time outside of IDC. And then the rest by Garrick.
Yeah, Liz, I'll add to that. So only just for clarity for everybody, right? Cynthia is on a very unique disaster relief operation. So you should now be able to see it on the screen. It does show an error message, so I'll acknowledge that. But within the shelter resident transition service, there is a create referrals where just like you do in recovery planning, you can issue referrals through Aunt Bertha, right, using the Aunt Bertha link within the shelter resident transition service. And best practice, right, when we're issuing a referral, we should be documenting it here within the system on ongoing future disaster relief operations.
Thanks, Garrick. And here's a report question. Are permissions for viewing reports based upon regions or divisions?
Yeah, my understanding is that report views are based off of your access in the system, and access on the system currently is mostly defined at the regional level. So when you build a report, you should be able to pull information for your region. If you think you need greater access, I would encourage you to work with your supervisor or regional application lead and have that conversation about what that would look like.
Thank you. A comment, love the dashboards and report. In a DR, is there a particular gap to request that can create and maintain these reports? Will information planning be trained in this? And Gary's laughing.
Whoever that is, I want to talk to you. No, in all seriousness, everybody is continuing to learn about RC Care, its reporting capabilities, etc. And so what we've tried to do on this first go around is just start to build things so that we can, one, socialize the capabilities, and then continue into those conversations about who best to do this. It's important to note that an information and planning individual might not have RC Care access, and having RC Care access is one of the steps needed to build a report. So right, that's just one thing that we can acknowledge will have to be worked through on operations. But if you're on a DRO and you're trying to build a report, know that there are tons and tons of templates out there. And if you're not able to, right, that's when we're going to elevate it to our supervisor, get talking with information and planning, and figure out, is there a resolution on the DRO? And if not, then it can be elevated outside of a DRO for additional support if it can't be solved within the DRO.
Thank you, Gary. It has been quite a while for the Louisiana hurricanes. How long did the SRT process take to begin?
So I understand the SRT started shuffling in September, late September, and we are still functioning with them. But mind you, we did have a transition into operational programs in the middle of that.
Okay. And I'm gonna
Liz, I'll add a little bit to that.
Thank you.
Yeah. So I think we all learned a lot this fall. Fall 2020 was in line with 2020 as a whole. And I think the word unprecedented, hopefully that makes you smile and kind of smirk like, oh, I just used that. So as Cynthia said, shelter resident transition began, right? In theory, it begins when shelters open because we're understanding our clients, we're starting to gather that information, and then we say we understand the picture, we can move forward. I think the overwhelming nature of fall 2020 really told us that maybe we can't start at the 72-hour mark. Maybe we can't start at the 96-hour mark. Maybe there's other things where we need to gather information from our partners or a state who's transferring shelters residents to us, etc. that really drove that. But if we think about shelter resident transition, we got to understand needs. That starts at the beginning. And so, Cynthia, I think you guys are on like month 5 or 6 of like actively supporting some recoveries. And people have been in shelters that long because Sonder clients have very, very complex situations, just like you and I do. And some of them are easier to resolve and some of them take longer to resolve.
Thank you, Gary. In the interest of time, we have like a 3 or 4 part question. So I'm just going to break it down to what I think this group can answer, and we'll go back and answer it fully in the chat. But what does a responder, if you have a DAT responder that wants to deploy as an SRT worker, what gap do they need to have?
Fantastic question, and potentially a great send-off. So a SRT worker at the caseworker level would need a RC Care SA gap, and then you get the SRT specialty track qualification. If I could do it quickly, I would do it now, but I'm going to have to like toggle through a bunch. So if you're interested in that, I would encourage you to talk to your supervisor, talk to your local disaster workforce engagement team about what those qualifications are. It's only a couple of extra trainings, and then the request can go in and the qualification can be added. And no, I'll also say, know that the qualification doesn't preclude you from deploying, but a DAT gap should also have the recovery gap supporting recovery on DROs.
Thank you for that, Garrick. With that, I'll turn it back to you again to close us out. We're at the bottom of the hour.
Cool. I'm going to come on camera because you guys don't need to see the screen and just say thank you from, we appreciate you guys taking the time. Hopefully this was insightful. And again, if you have any questions, additional comments, things you want covered, let us know. There's ongoing office hours every week. I know Liz and Alicia have a great one set up for next week. So same location, same time kind of thing. But really, really, truly, we're super excited that shelter resident transition is built into RC Care. And we hope that this was informational for you so that going forward, you feel better equipped and know that we're working on a step-by-step guide. So Flo Hankin, the amazing recovery guru that she is, she put together a step-by-step recovery planning guide. Know that one of those is in the works for shelter resident transition as well, just so that in the future, when you deploy, there's an easy referenceable guide with pictures and descriptions about actions that need to be taken. So with that, guys, thank you so much for taking the time. Cynthia, do you wanna say anything to the group before we go?
Thank you for letting me mutter through all that, and thank you for the opportunity, and best wishes to anybody that's on deployment doing this. It's a great opportunity, great tools. Thank you, Garrick, for everything that you're doing to support it.
Yeah, cool. Thanks, guys. Have a great day. Talk to you later.